Welcome to my channel, Conversations with Dr. Sue. I want to share with you one of the ways in which I manage and balance my own stresses. And how I do this is by making and baking sourdough bread. Everything that I do in my life has a story and a backstory, so forgive me for this. It started some years ago. I was staying in my holiday house with my late partner Neville, and his dear friend of many years came to visit. And his dear friend had been ill. He had some form of cancer. And his daughter was a nutritionist, and she told her dad that for him to heal, he needs to eat sourdough bread, amongst other things. So I went to the local bakery and I bought him sourdough for his stay with us. And it was so delicious that I wanted to learn how to make it myself. So I went back to the bakery with my pen and paper in hand, and I wanted to learn how to make it, how to make the starter, how to bake the bread from the dough. And it was so complicated that I thought, no bugger this. I'm going to learn how to do it with Google. So I got hold of some Google recipes on how to make starter, and then by chance I came upon how to buy a starter. So I bought one. I paid so much money for the starter and the sourdough kit that my partner was saying how much each loaf that I made was costing. It was costing a fortune, was costing a couple of $100 per loaf, but got less and less as I made more and more. And then I killed the starter. So I decided I need to make my own starter. After many flops and many failures and many that tasted doughy and yucky, I think I've got it right. And in the meantime, our friend has thrived, and sadly my partner Neville has passed away. So I'm making this bread in honor of Neville and his friend, and I want to share it with you. I think I've got it right. It's important that you bake it with love. You bake it from your heart and it will taste delicious. I pass it around to my family and friends, and they love it, and I like it. I can't quite honestly eat other bread anymore. Without bragging too much, I like my own bread. Here I'm going to show you how I start from the very, very beginning. And what I do is I take a clean glass jar, and into the jar I put 60 grams of brown bread wheat flour. And if it's slightly more or slightly less, don't stress. And I use Eureka. I just find it a very nice quality of flour. And to that, I add 60 grams of lukewarm water. Almost there, 60. And I mix the flour and the water well together until it's like a paste. Well, with a fork, and put a lid on and leave it at room temperature for 48 hours. The reason why one uses brown bread wheat flour is that it starts the starter faster. That's what it said on my Google. This starter has sat for 48 hours at room temperature. And what you do now is you take 60 grams from the starter into a clean bowl, and you mix that with 60 grams of lukewarm water. And 60 grams of white bread flour. I use Eureka. We mix it well together. I use a fork. So the starter with the second day of making needs to look like this. Bit like porridge. You've mixed it and you put a lid on and you leave it at room temperature. This is the third time that we're going to be making the sourdough starter, and it looks like this. So we're going to be adding 60 grams of the sourdough starter with 60 grams of white bread flour. The reason for us using white flour after the first mixing is we use brown bread flour in the first mixing to speed up the process of all the bacteria coming into the air so that it can ferment. And after that, we use only white flour until we make the dough. And now we put in 60 grams of lukewarm water and we mix it with a fork until it's like a paste, like it was after the first mixing and the second mixing. Once more, we cover this with a lid and leave it for another 24 hours at room temperature.
But you have to know that my starter is called Bubbles. Both of my parents' nicknames were Bubbles. My mum because she was very bubbly, and my dad because when he was very little, his hair was very curly. He had blonde curly hair, so they called him Bubbles. And when I was thinking about a name for the sourdough, which who knows may be passed down through the generations, I first thought of naming it after one of or all of my grandchildren. And then I thought, no, both my parents' names were Bubbles, and so the sourdough starter gets bubbly, so why not call it Bubbles? We're in Langebaan today, and we are going to be feeding our sourdough starter. I'm going to be putting 50 grams of sourdough starter in the ball jar and 50 in the other jar so that we can make 2 loaves. And to that, we are going to mix 100 of lukewarm water. And to this, we put 100 grams of white bread flour. And quite honestly, if you're a few grams over or a few grams under, it really doesn't make a big difference. There's 100 in each. And I take a long fork, I mix this to a paste. Just give it a mix so that the flour and water and starter that we made are mixed together, that there are no real lumps. And we leave it overnight, and you will see tomorrow morning how it's so wonderful and bubbly. And that is with no yeast at all. It's all the little yeast in the air, the natural yeast in the air. And this is langebind yeast, so it has to be very good. And it looks like this. So for extra, I make another sourdough bread, the third one. And this one is bigger than the other two. And for purposes of having enough sourdough starter that I can keep in the fridge to make whenever I want to and to make as many breads as I want to, I make double the amount of feeding the starter. And this we leave with the other two overnight, and we see you again tomorrow morning where they're bubbling and flourishing. Good morning. Today we are very excited to make our sourdough. First, we take 10 grams of salt and we mix 300 grams of lukewarm water. There we go. And I just smush it around a little bit, dissolve it in the water, and to that I add 180 grams of the sourdough that we mixed last night, that we fed last night. We mixed it, we fed it, and look how amazing. It looks so bubbly and ready. The smell is amazing. You can smell the sourdough wanting to start rising and making us wonderful bread. So we add 180 grams, which is almost all of this in the ball jar. The rest of this I add to yesterday's sourdough to use for next time. Have a look. There's almost nothing left. And then we start to add the flour. And for the flour, we use white bread flour that we used for the starter, 200 grams of white bread flour. There. And then we do the same with brown bread, wheat flour, again 200 grams. I used to only make with white bread flour, and then I decided some time ago to try a mix of white and brown, and then I use rye flour. It's the same make. It's also Eureka, not difficult to find. Eureka rye flour just adds a lovely, lovely taste to the bread. 50 grams. If one puts too much rye flour in, it gets too dense, but some people prefer to have a higher density. I like it. It stays soft. It works out to 10% because there's 200 grams of brown, 200 grams of white, and 50 grams of rye. And then what we need to do is to give it a rough mix. And I do this with the back of a wooden spoon. And I mix it just roughly. Just get the flour and starter and water mixed in roughly. you're going to see with time how it all comes together and all the ingredients talk to each other. But interesting, this is just flour and water and salt at this stage. With the bacteria in the air and the yeast in the air, you'll see we'll come up with something quite amazing. It relaxes me, it heals me, and it's good for my general well-being. I just take off the excess dough with a knife. And I wipe the side of the bowl, and it looks more or less like this. A little bit rough and not all mixed together, but just as much as possible for the first mix. What I do now is I cover these and I leave them for 30 minutes. This is the starter, the leftover starter that I had in the fridge from last night, from when we fed the starter to leave it overnight. I've just taken it out of the fridge, and we're going to put some into each of these 3 jars. Just a bit. I don't measure it. I just put some of the old starter into each of the 3 jars, like so and like so. It seems like the old starter mixed with the new starter just comes out perfect. Then I take a little from the small bread starter. There's only that much left. So I put a little into one of the jars, just that it's got a taste. You have to understand that in these starters, there are millions and trillions of yeast particles and bacteria and things that make the bread rise. And then this is my magic. This is the one that we made double. We fed double the starter. So I put into each of the jars some of this, so that they have a good mix of old and new. And then I'm going to give these a little rough stir, just to mix the olds with the news. I give a little rough stir and I put them in the fridge for further use. So this is the 4th time that we're going to mix our sourdough. Looks like this to start. And I also here give it 20 turns from bottom to top. 19, 20, none for luck. And it looks like that when I'm finished this mixing. Cover, and this time we leave it to prove for between 3.5 and 4 hours. One needs to eyeball it and check how it's looking. I think this sourdough bread making is pretty much about look and feel and eyeball it and make some mistakes and find your own way depending on the temperature of the day, depending on how you're feeling. Because if you're making it with love, it's going to be divine. So this again is going to stay at room temperature for between 3.5 and 4 hours. And we'll see how it is then. And then we mix it and put it into proving baskets. These are the proving baskets, the regular size and the larger size. And what I've done yesterday is to take a spray bottle and spray water around. This I'm doing to season the baskets. I spray with water, and then what I do is I take some rice flour, white rice flour, and I pour it into the baskets and smush it around a bit. I'm not going to do it right now, but I let it cover the inside of the basket to stop it from sticking. So I'm going to take the first regular size sourdough that has now risen, and you can see how beautiful it looks. And if you could just smell how gorgeous it smells. And this time what I do is I turn it like I did before 10 or 12 times, like this. Punch it down, and it comes away from the glass. The gluten has developed. 9, 10, enough. It's enough. And now I pour it into the proving basket like so. Whoops. You see how it comes away from the side of the glass bowl. Like so. And then I take my hands and I push the dough from side to side. And then what I do is I take this white rice flour and I sprinkle it quite liberally on the top of the dough. And then I cover the dough with Glad wrap in the basket, because I'm going to now leave the dough for 30 minutes before I put it into the fridge overnight before we bake it. So the dough has sat in the proving baskets for 30 minutes, and now we're going to put them into the fridge overnight, and then tomorrow morning we can bake. Good morning, and finally this morning we're going to bake the sourdough that has sat in the fridge overnight and waiting for us to bake this morning. There's a noise in the background, and that's the fan of the oven. You switch your oven on. I use fan 210 degrees centigrade for 20 minutes. And here we pray. We pray that it comes out of the proving basket. And I carefully put it. There we go. Looks good. And the second one, first I pull it a little across to give this one space, and that one just plops out. And then we use what we call a lame. It's a lame. It's a blade on a stick, an old-fashioned blade on a stick, and we score the bread so that it can rise and open. And this is how we do it. I make a big cut down the middle, and then I make small little cuts on the side. It's just my own pattern, but you can do any pattern you like. Have fun. And then I've put some bread flour into a little strainer, and just like it looks as if it's come out of a bakery, I go like this on the bread, just to make it look pretty. And just check that the temperature is 210 degrees, and we put it in first for 20 minutes. And then once the 20 minutes are up, we turn it down to 190 degrees centigrade. But as I put it in, I'm going to throw some water into a container at the bottom of the oven. It just helps the bread to crisp and rise. This is the stage where one can play. You look at the color of the bread and you decide, does it need an extra 20 minutes or does it need an extra 15 minutes? Look at the color of it. If it's already golden color when it's already done 20 minutes, then you leave it for 15 minutes, but you eyeball it. When 20 minutes have gone by, and we turn the oven down to 190 degrees centigrade, like so. But we leave the door closed, and then we put on, I think what I'm going to do is put on the timer for another 20 minutes, but I'm going to look after 15 how brown it is. The oven's got a life of its own. The bread has a life of its own. I have a life of its own in relation to the bread. So we eyeball, we see what color is right, how it feels, how it looks, and then we go from there. So we take this beautiful, beautiful bread off the baking tray. And as you notice, they don't stick, and it looks like this. And we put it on the cooling rack to cool. Just a reminder not to cut it before it's absolutely cool. Otherwise it gets squished and squashed and you don't get the best crumb and taste.